I had been living a fairly peaceful life in Denver when I got that frantic call. My neighbor from back home, a soft-spoken man named Carl, called me at dawn, breathlessly urging me to return to my grandfather's ranch right away. At first I thought he was exaggerating. Carl was known for sometimes getting a little too alarmed over small things, like a stray coyote or a rumor of a rattlesnake den in the brush, yet his voice shook so much this time that I knew it had to be urgent. He kept saying something about a construction crew and HOA trucks that had shown up on my land. Confused, I tried to make sense of it. Why would a homeowners association be on my ranch, putting up temporary fencing and clearing soil? My ranch was far from any residential development. I'd inherited it from my grandfather not long ago, but I hadn't had time to do much with it yet. When I pressed Carl for details, he admitted he didn't know much more, only that, seemingly overnight, a large, well-funded operation had begun erecting houses on a big chunk of my land. It sounded absurd. Stunned, I booked a flight for the very next morning, my mind reeling at the possibility that someone was actually building homes on private property that didn't belong to them. My grandfather's ranch was in a small town in rural Montana, a place that prided itself on open spaces, neighborly values, and respect for personal boundaries. The thought that an HOA, of all organizations, was moving in with that kind of audacity was baffling. Even more perplexing, HOAs typically govern subdivisions, neighborhoods with strict covenants and codes. They had no jurisdiction on a private ranch miles away from any city center, or so I'd assumed. But as I'd soon discover, this wasn't just a run-of-the-mill situation. It was something that ran deeper, reaching into local power structures. Arriving in town, I felt a twinge of nostalgia. Memories flooded my mind. My grandfather teaching me how to ride a horse, the old barn where we'd spent late nights mending fences, the vast expanse of fields and rolling hills that made this ranch a piece of history. I hadn't realized how much I missed it until I saw that iconic wooden gate with our family's name, Wells, etched into it. But my homesickness was cut short the moment I noticed a row of brand new houses, aligned in neat formation, standing on the far side of the ranch. They looked bizarre in the wide-open countryside, as if transplanted from some suburban development. The presence of bulldozers, stacks of lumber, and busy construction workers was surreal. My heart pounded. There was no question. Someone had moved in big time. Before I could confront anyone, I spotted a woman in a crisp blazer calmly issuing directives to a group of men in neon vests. She glanced in my direction, her eyes flashing with the kind of self-assured authority that suggested she was used to getting her way. Carl, who had driven me from the airport, pointed discreetly. "That's Diane," he whispered. "She's the head of the local HOA, or at least that's the organization's name, but I hear she practically owns the planning board in this county." I stepped out of the truck, trying to conceal the churning mixture of anxiety and anger in my stomach. I approached Diane, mustering my calmest voice, and introduced myself as the property owner. She offered a tight-lipped smile, more of a polite sneer than a genuine greeting. "Oh, you must be the grandson," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We've been expecting you." That statement rattled me. Expecting me? Why on earth would they anticipate my arrival when they'd made no attempt to notify me about building on my land? But I kept my composure, politely demanding an explanation. Diane smoothly delivered a rehearsed line about how my grandfather in his final months had supposedly considered entering an agreement with the HOA to develop part of the ranch, turning it into a small, eco-friendly community. She even hinted that I might find certain legal documents supporting that partnership if I checked his files carefully. That was all news to me, and it didn't sound remotely like something my grandfather would have wanted. He'd always been fiercely protective of the land. He believed in preserving the natural environment, and he had a deep disdain for overdevelopment, especially the kind that tore up wildlife habitats. Yet Diane's words were cunning, aimed at planting seeds of doubt. She seemed utterly unruffled by my protests, as though she was counting on me being too stunned or unprepared to fight back. As I continued to stare in disbelief at the progress of construction, I could see partially finished homes, some with just the frames standing, others almost complete, neatly painted and framed by wide asphalt driveways. 72 houses, Carl had said, though I hadn't yet counted them personally. A small, glitzy sales office was set up in what used to be my grandfather's old tractor storage shed. Brightly colored flags fluttered in the wind, advertising luxury countryside living and Green Acres Estates, a Diane Gardens community. It felt like a nightmare. The unspoiled serenity of this ranch, which had been in my family for generations, was now being turned into a suburban sprawl under the watch of an HOA president, who had evidently allied herself with local authorities. My initial shock was overwhelming, but I forced myself to focus. There was no time to dwell on heartbreak. I needed to figure out the next steps. Driving up the dusty ranch road toward the old farmhouse, my grandfather's favorite place, I felt the weight of the situation settle on my shoulders. The house stood in stark contrast to the glaring new developments in the distance. It was rustic but dignified, with a wrap-around porch and a squeaky wooden swing my grandmother used to love. Although the roof needed repairs and the paint had chipped in places, it was still a sanctuary of memories. I unlocked the door, stepping into an interior that smelled faintly of old leather and the comforting musk of aged wood. My grandfather's spirit was alive here, in the worn armchair by the fireplace and the rows of books lining the shelves in the study. That's when I remembered a clue from my childhood. My grandfather often mentioned that if anything ever happened to him, I should look inside his old steel safe in the study. At the time, I assumed he was talking about his will or bank statements. But now I suspected there could be something else, something that might explain why Diane and her HOA felt so confident encroaching on this land. My mind replayed fleeting conversations I'd had with Grandpa, how he seemed to hint there was an old boundary dispute decades ago, how he'd meticulously gathered land surveys, how he kept detailed diaries of any visitors who set foot on the ranch. Had he left behind a hidden piece of the puzzle that would prove these new developments were illegal? I fumbled for the combination to the safe, my hands trembling with impatience. Inside, I found an antique ledger, stacks of folded maps, and a stack of letters, some with official seals. It was a trove of documentation which I was certain Deanne had never laid eyes on. Otherwise, she wouldn't be so brazen. Opening the ledger, I discovered my grandfather's handwritten notes. He documented every time a local official tried to get him to rezone the land, every conversation with surveyors who arrived under suspicious pretenses. There were references to wetlands on the property, protected by state environmental laws, and detailed notes about legal boundaries that extended beyond the typical property lines. If my grandfather's writing was accurate, nearly half the area where those houses now stood was designated as a protected zone, strictly off-limits for development. On reading further, I realized that Grandpa had indeed anticipated some attempt by local power players to grab the land. He seemed to have prepared a trap, as he called it in one cryptic entry. He wrote that if someone tried to build without proper authorization, the legal ramifications would be massive, provided the rightful owner knew what to do with the evidence. This was the first glimmer of hope I'd felt since landing in Montana. Clearly, Grandpa suspected something fishy long before I did. He'd left me the ammunition I needed to fight back, and perhaps that was the reason Diane had tried to start construction so quickly, hoping I wouldn't discover these materials in time. Still, I had to tread carefully. Diane wasn't just some meddling busybody. She had connections. Carl had whispered that the mayor was her cousin, and the county zoning board president was an old friend of hers. People were reluctant to stand up to Diane because they feared losing their jobs or facing legal troubles. That explained how entire houses could be built under the radar. Local oversight was basically in her pocket. Returning to the living room, I found Carl waiting for me. He looked relieved that I hadn't completely lost my mind. "You've got to stop them," he said, his voice shaking. "What they're doing isn't right. Nobody here dared say a word, but your grandfather always told us that you'd come back and protect this place." As evening set in, I made my way to the newly constructed portion of the ranch to find an official from the county who I'd seen earlier in a blue pickup truck. If they were ignoring standard procedure, I wanted to confront them directly. The official's name tag identified him as Jim Roth, County Inspections Manager. He tried to avoid eye contact when I approached, but I cornered him politely. "I'm going to file a formal complaint," I told him, producing a copy of an environmental assessment from Grandpa's documents. It clearly labeled large parts of the ranch as protected wetlands. Jim stammered, insisting he wasn't aware of these designations. I asked how he could possibly sign off on new construction without a thorough environmental review. Before he could answer, Diane sauntered over, flashing that sharp, authoritative smile again. "Is there a problem?" she asked, with mock innocence. I explained that I would be bringing an injunction against the HOA to halt construction. Diane's calm demeanor momentarily flickered. She reminded me that the community had already invested heavily in this project, that future homeowners were counting on these properties, and that halting construction could cost me dearly in lawsuits. But I stood my ground. This was my land, and it was illegally built upon. She'd have a fight on her hands no matter how many friends she had in high places. She shot me a glare that told me I was stepping into dangerous territory. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The next morning, I discovered that the water supply to the old farmhouse had been cut off. The main well line had been tampered with, and the next day the electricity followed suit. Carl reported that he saw trucks belonging to the local utility company, also rumored to be under Diane's influence, pulling away just after midnight. When I called the utility to complain, they insisted there was a maintenance issue they had to address, and they couldn't provide a timeline for restoring service. That was my first personal taste of Diane's intimidation tactics, cutting off basic utilities to pressure me into backing down. I spent the next several days meeting with a local lawyer, a sturdy woman named Maria Gomez, who was known for her integrity and her willingness to take on powerful opponents. Maria had a reputation for championing underdogs, and when I presented her with Grandpa's documents and diaries, she grew visibly excited. "There's a real case here," she said, flipping through the evidence. "If even half of this checks out, we can stop them in their tracks." But she also warned me of Diane's power in the county. "Expect them to countersue," Maria cautioned. "They'll claim your grandfather gave verbal approval or that you neglected the land. They'll try anything to make it look like you're just meddling." Sure enough, 2 days later, I received a notice from the local court stating that the Cajo HO was seeking damages against me for obstructing community development and interfering with signed purchase agreements. It was absurd, like they were accusing me of trespassing on my own ranch. My fury surged, but I had to remain calm. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my grandfather's legacy and preserving the land from reckless expansion. Maria reassured me that the countersuit was mostly a scare tactic. We had the stronger legal footing, but the next step was to gather more evidence and community support. It was time to talk to the neighbors, many of whom had been my grandfather's friends for decades. One by one, I visited the old homesteads that dotted the countryside. Folks like Nancy and Roy, who ran a small dairy farm near the eastern boundary, remembered that my grandfather used to keep meticulous logs of the water table levels. They told me about a monthly meeting he held to discuss environmental conservation, inviting neighbors to share any suspicious activity they spotted. Roy even recalled the day a group claiming to be from the county came to survey the land but refused to show identification. Grandpa kicked them off the ranch. Now, these same neighbors were ready to stand by me, offering eyewitness accounts of the shady tactics used by Diane's associates. They were tired of living in fear, and they believed my grandfather's memory deserved better. With each conversation, I gained allies and information. Several local ranchers recalled that Diane had pressured them to join her HOA as well, promising improvements to roads and utilities, but eventually saddling them with outrageous fees and restrictive rules. When they refused, she allegedly manipulated county inspectors to fine them for minor code violations. Another was forced to sell a portion of his land to cover sudden infrastructure fees the HOA claimed. My anger grew with every story, but so did my determination. These people had suffered in isolation, bullied by a woman who leveraged her connections to enrich herself. Yet there was also a sense of hope brewing as we started to band together. Among the most damning pieces of evidence was an old topographical map in Grandpa's safe. It depicted the original ranch boundaries along with a series of wetlands designated by the state decades ago. The map carried official stamps from environmental agencies, and in my grandfather's notes, he mentioned that a good portion of those wetlands had been recorded as a conservation easement. This meant no construction could legally occur there without serious reviews and permits that, as far as I could tell, the HOA never obtained. This was the very heart of Grandpa's trap. If anyone tried to develop that protected land, they'd be in direct violation of multiple state and federal laws. Confident now in the strength of my case, I filed a motion to halt the construction immediately. The local court, likely influenced by Diane, delayed the hearing, scheduling it weeks out. That gave the HOA more time to build. At the same time, my neighbors and I put together a petition. We gathered signatures from residents all over the county who were either directly harmed by the HOA's tactics or simply supported property rights and environmental preservation. Diane's camp retaliated by blanketing the town with flyers labeling me a selfish heir, claiming I was hoarding land that should be used for housing. Some who had initially supported me started to waver under the HOA's propaganda. To counteract this smear campaign, I decided to call a community meeting at the local town hall, the same place where folks once gathered for holiday festivities and charity drives. With the help of Maria, Carl, and my new allies, I planned to present the documents, show the wetlands map, and give the community a clear picture of the illegal activity. Meanwhile, construction continued at a frantic pace, with trucks roaring day and night, throwing up house frames as if they wanted to finish the entire development before a judge could weigh in. When the day of the community meeting arrived, tension was palpable. The large hall was packed. Some wore expressions of curiosity, others of skepticism, and a few displayed quiet relief, as if they had long waited for someone to challenge Diane's reign. I stood at the front, flipping through a slideshow of photos showing the bulldozers arrived, then the destructive process that had followed. People gasped at the footage of uprooted trees and churned-up wetlands. Once the screen displayed the official conservation documents, a murmur spread through the crowd. This was no rumor or personal vendetta. We had real proof. Diane was there too, flanked by a small entourage of lawyers and local officials, including Jim Roth. She tried to interrupt multiple times, calling my evidence outdated or forged, but each time she spoke, Maria calmly displayed yet another official stamp or pointed to the relevant law that protected the land. It was like watching a slow unraveling of Diane's carefully curated story. Then a hush fell when I read a portion of my grandfather's diary aloud, describing how the land was meant to remain a sanctuary, how it was his dying wish that the ranch never be carved up by greedy developers. His words resonated deeply with many in the audience, who remembered Grandpa as a stalwart of the community, a man who once helped neighbors rebuild barns after a tornado and always donated generously to local causes. Midway through the presentation, a bold neighbor named Patricia, previously too frightened to speak, stood up. She confessed that Diane's associates had threatened her with legal action if she didn't sign certain papers relinquishing a part of her own land for HOA improvements. Other neighbors chimed in with similar stories. The energy in the room shifted dramatically. People were no longer just seeing me as a young heir trying to block construction. They saw a pattern of abuse and corruption. The local newspaper's editor, who was also present, scribbled notes furiously, realizing this was a big story. As the crowd's sentiment turned against her, Diane attempted a final gamble. She produced a letter with a suspicious signature, claiming it was written by my grandfather, granting the HOA permission to begin development. But even a quick glance at the signature made it obvious something was off. Grandpa's name was spelled incorrectly, and the style was entirely different from every other document. Maria politely asked to examine the letter. "Nice try," she said, handing it back. "But forgery is a serious crime, and it looks like you've just shown everyone a blatant fake." An uneasy silence followed. Diane's supporters, or those who still believed in her authority, started inching away. With the community outraged and the local press beginning to publish critical articles, the county commissioners could no longer ignore the scandal. They voted to impose an immediate stop-work order on the development, pending investigation. The sense of relief among the ranchers and neighbors was tangible, yet Diane didn't give up quietly. She vowed to fight in court, claiming that the wetlands designation was no longer valid and that she had new environmental impact studies supporting her cause. However, she couldn't produce any legitimate studies, and the ones she hinted at contradicted the official records. A few days later, the county court hearing finally arrived. By that time, even the judge seemed fully aware of the public outrage. Maria presented our evidence methodically: the original conservation easement, the documented intimidation tactics, the forgery attempts. Witness after witness testified about Diane's manipulation and underhanded methods. The courtroom was packed with locals eager to see how this would unfold. Diane's high-priced lawyers offered flimsy rebuttals, mostly claiming it was all a misunderstanding or a smear campaign against an HOA that only wanted to improve the community. But when confronted with the actual law, the official stamps, and the wetlands data, they had no solid ground to stand on. In a dramatic moment of final testimony, we showcased a full aerial photograph of the ranch's wetlands from decades ago, overlaid with a modern satellite image that still indicated the presence of the same ecological features. This left no room for doubt. The land where 72 houses were being erected was in large measure a legally protected zone. The judge ruled decisively in our favor, issuing a permanent injunction to halt construction. Moreover, the judge ordered an investigation into the permitting process, suspecting corruption. The courtroom erupted in a wave of cheers and applause. For many, this was about more than just my ranch. It was a victory against a powerful figure who had run roughshod over the community for years. The fallout for Diane was swift. Within days, the mayor, her cousin, distanced himself publicly, declaring he had no knowledge of her illicit maneuvers. The county zoning board president, her old friend, resigned under pressure from newly released documents that implicated him in questionable approvals. The press coverage, both local and regional, was relentless, highlighting how Diane had exploited her position to push through an illegal development on preserved land. Lawsuits began piling up against her personally, and it became clear that her empire was crumbling. In a particularly ironic twist, the prospective homebuyers, some of whom had already signed contracts, turned their ire toward Diane for misrepresenting the property's status. They sued her for fraud, dragging her HOA into further legal chaos. Meanwhile, on the ranch, we set about removing the partially built structures that violated environmental guidelines. The damage was disheartening, but thanks to the funds I was able to secure through separate civil claims against the HOA, we started restoring the wetlands. Volunteers from the community helped replant native grasses and trees. Environmental groups offered guidance, providing seedlings and teaching us how to rejuvenate the soil. It was a painstaking process, but each day I felt closer to honoring my grandfather's legacy and fulfilling the responsibility he had entrusted to me. As the legal battles simmered down, I was finally able to catch my breath. The farmhouse got its water and electricity back, courtesy of some newly hired county officials who were appalled at how the utilities had been weaponized against me. Perhaps the most heartening development was the renewed sense of unity among neighbors. People who used to keep their heads down, intimidated by Diane's power, now came together for potlucks, barn dances, and volunteer cleanup. Carl admitted he'd been afraid to stand up alone, worried about repercussions. But with all of us unified, he realized that Diane's intimidation worked only when people were isolated. The ranch that had once seemed overshadowed by bulldozers and lawsuits was now a place of shared purpose and rejuvenation. Weeks later, I discovered another hidden gem in my grandfather's study, a small notebook tucked behind the old ledger. In it, he'd scribbled reflections about the ranch, the environment, and the importance of standing up for what's right. One particular passage stood out. He wrote that land isn't just dirt and grass. It's a symbol of the collective heritage and responsibility we share with our community. He believed that preserving a piece of nature was preserving our own humanity, ensuring future generations would experience the same wonders he had cherished. Reading his words felt like having one final conversation with him, and it spurred me to keep rebuilding. No longer overshadowed by the threat of forced development, I worked with local conservationists to establish an official stewardship program. We placed clear signage around the wetlands explaining their importance to local wildlife, from migratory birds to fish that relied on clean water sources. Students from the nearby high school took field trips to the ranch, learning about ecology, conservation, and the legal battles that sometimes arise to protect nature. Many of them were shocked to learn how close we came to losing this fragile habitat. Their curiosity and passion gave me hope that the next generation would value open spaces even more fiercely. Diane's downfall was a lesson in hubris. At first, she attempted to salvage her reputation, blaming corrupt underlings for forging documents, but the evidence was too strong and the community had seen too much. She faced multiple charges, including fraud and filing false statements with government agencies. The last I heard, she was entangled in legal proceedings that would likely keep her busy for years. The HOA she once commanded became a byword for corruption and overreach. Meanwhile, those who had unknowingly been part of the development plan either found alternative housing in legally zoned areas or joined the lawsuits seeking restitution from Diane. The day the last bulldozer left was a day of quiet triumph. I stood at the edge of the ranch, gazing at the partial foundation of one of those ill-fated houses, now stripped down to rubble. It felt surreal to think about how different things could have been if I hadn't discovered Grandpa's documentation, or if I'd been too intimidated to stand up for what was right. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming gratitude for my grandfather's foresight, for the neighbors who banded together, and for the land itself that somehow maintained its resilience despite the upheaval. Over the next few months, I resumed a somewhat normal routine, splitting my time between improving the ranch's infrastructure and working with environmental experts who wanted to research the wetlands more thoroughly. I soon realized that my original plan of living in the city might not be where my heart belonged. Each day on the ranch, I felt a deeper connection to the fields, the smell of fresh hay, the sight of hawks circling overhead. This was where I could truly make a difference, not just for me, but for the entire community that depended on the ranch's natural balance. When the next county election rolled around, there was a wave of reform candidates championing transparency and environmental integrity. Many of them credited the Wells Ranch case for awakening public awareness about how easy it can be for powerful interests to sidestep regulations if no one holds them accountable. I was invited to speak at various community forums about my experience, and though public speaking wasn't my forte, I accepted. I wanted people to understand that you don't need to be a high-powered politician or a wealthy corporation to fight for your rights and protect what matters. You just need the truth, determination, and a bit of solidarity from those around you. The more I shared Grandpa's story, the more I realized this wasn't just about saving a ranch. It was about inspiring others to stand up against wrongdoing in any form. I had countless conversations with local farmers, teachers, and small business owners who told me they'd become more vigilant about local decisions, whether it was zoning laws or municipal contracts. They realized that one unscrupulous individual could exploit the system if nobody questioned the process. The feeling of renewed civic engagement was tangible. People were more outspoken at town halls, more conscientious about the environment. In the midst of rebuilding the ranch and forging new community connections, I stumbled across some old tapes my grandfather had recorded, presumably for me to watch someday. They were stored in a dusty box in the attic, labeled for the future. Although the technology was outdated, I managed to find a player. There he was, seated in his favorite armchair, wearing a big smile. He looked directly into the camera and said, "If you're watching this, I'm guessing troubles come knocking. Always remember, this land has survived countless storms and challenges. It's not the soil or the fences that define it. It's the heart of the people who nurture it. I felt tears pricking my eyes as he continued with that gentle wisdom that only he possessed. Those words echoed in my mind as I finished replanting a row of willow trees along the creek, an area that had been torn up by construction equipment. One of the last tasks in restoring the wetlands was stabilizing the banks, and willow trees helped hold the soil together. The creek was running clearer now, fish were returning, and birds nested in the newly planted shrubs. It was like watching life breathe back into a wounded landscape. Carl, who had become one of my closest confidants, remarked that the ranch was starting to look like it did in the old days. I grinned, remembering that my grandfather would always say, "Nature has a funny way of healing if we only give it the chance." By the time the official investigation concluded, several local officials who had colluded with Diane faced disciplinary action. Some lost their jobs, others were fined or had to deal with lawsuits of their own. The broader message had been sent. This county would no longer be a place where backroom deals and intimidation flourished unchecked. Meanwhile, Maria, the lawyer who first took my case, became something of a local hero. She used the momentum from our victory to advocate for stronger land use regulations and more transparent government practices. I donated a portion of my settlement winnings to her nonprofit legal fund, ensuring that other small landowners who face similar harassment could access quality representation. Gradually, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. The ranch remained a testament to the power of resilience, its rolling hills no longer marred by the skeletal frames of illegal houses. The nights were quiet and star-filled again, unpolluted by the glare of unwanted suburban streetlights. Each dawn brought a chorus of birds that seemed louder than I ever remembered, a symbolic reminder that the ranch was still alive and thriving. Sometimes I'd catch sight of a coyote in the distance or a deer drinking from the creek, and I'd wonder if they knew how close they'd come to losing their habitat. One of the final chapters in the Diane saga occurred when the state's attorney general picked up the case, citing the alleged forgeries and environmental violations as grounds for criminal charges. Her trial date was set, and although I didn't relish the idea of celebrating another person's downfall, I recognized that justice needed to be served. She had not only trespassed on my land, but had also tried to rewrite the law for her own gain. The last thing I heard, she was contemplating a plea bargain, but details were murky. The important thing for me was that she could no longer harm others or exploit her once formidable network of connections. In the aftermath, the ranch became a local landmark, an example of how ordinary citizens could stand up for their rights. School children toured the property to study the wetlands, occasionally squealing with delight upon spotting tadpoles or rare bird species. Elderly neighbors who remembered my grandfather often stopped by to share stories, some of them so amusing or poignant that I wished I'd heard them while Grandpa was still around. And through it all, the farmhouse's porch swing remained a comfortable vantage point from which to watch the sunrise, the horizon glowing over the now protected fields. Beyond the environmental aspect, I realized that Grandpa's hidden trap had an even deeper layer. He'd left behind a blueprint for community solidarity. His diaries didn't just detail official stamps and land surveys. They told of the times he'd reached out to neighbors, how he'd quietly paid the grocery bill for someone in need, or how he'd helped fix a local farmer's irrigation system without ever asking for anything in return. Reading his accounts, I saw that the real trap Diane walked into wasn't merely about legal technicalities. She had underestimated the bonds of community and the potency of shared purpose. Once people united, her power fell apart like a house of cards. This realization shaped my own perspective. I decided not to wall myself off in bitterness or maintain a perpetual grudge against Diane and her cohorts. Instead, I focused on positive actions, more volunteer events, more engagement with local governance, more championing of the idea that neighbors should look after one another. Over time, I saw a shift in the town's culture, less apathy, more collaboration. While we still had disagreements and the occasional power struggle, the memory of the HOA fiasco served as a reminder that none of us could afford to be complacent. In many ways, the ranch flourished because of what we'd gone through together. We established a community agriculture program, renting small plots to locals who wanted to grow organic produce. An annual harvest festival took root, bringing in families from across the county. Funds raised at the festival went to environmental projects and youth scholarships. Grandpa would have been proud. This was the kind of inclusive, cooperative spirit he believed in, a far cry from the secrecy and deceit that had nearly destroyed the land. In that spirit of unity, I welcomed back some of the construction workers who had lost their jobs when the project collapsed. They weren't to blame for following orders, and many of them were just trying to put food on the table. A few showed genuine remorse for what had happened, especially once they understood how illegal the operation was. I offered them a chance to contribute to the ranch restoration efforts, and they proved invaluable in repairing old structures and building new fences that actually benefited the property. Instead of houses, they helped construct a modest visitor center that explained the ranch's history, environmental significance, and the hard-fought battle to protect it. As winter approached, I'd sometimes walk through the quiet fields, now dotted with patches of snow, and marvel at how quickly nature can reclaim what's rightfully hers. The bare branches and frozen creeks reminded me of the cyclical nature of life and how, just like the seasons, the ranch would continue to transform and thrive. On one particularly cold evening, I bundled up and sat on the porch swing thinking about everything that had happened. In the distance, I saw the faint glow of farmhouses where my neighbors lived. Neighbors who had become friends and allies. It felt peaceful, almost like the land was breathing a sigh of relief. Looking back, the ordeal with Diane and the brazen HOA taught me one of the most profound lessons of my life, that standing up for something meaningful is rarely simple or painless, but it's always worth it. Our convictions, when coupled with evidence, community support, and a steadfast refusal to be bullied, can overcome even the most entrenched corruption. My grandfather understood this deeply, which is why he left the documents that formed the basis of our legal strategy. That was the trap he set, and it was the key to saving the ranch. Today, when people ask me how we managed to overcome a well-connected adversary, I tell them it boiled down to two main ingredients: courage and unity. Courage to speak up, and unity in supporting one another. It might sound cliché, but that's exactly what happened. Individuals who had once felt isolated under Dion's intimidation found a collective voice. Our shared sense of justice and the undeniable fact that we had the truth on our side carried us through the darkest moment. We faced sabotage, lawsuits, and smear campaigns, but none of that stood a chance against a community that finally decided enough was enough. Now, as I restore one last corner of the ranch, removing debris and planting wildflowers that Grandpa loved, I can't help but feel overwhelming gratitude. Gratitude for Carl's urgent phone call, which set everything in motion. Gratitude for the neighbors who risked angering a powerful figure to fight for what was right. Gratitude for Maria's legal brilliance, and for the judge who refused to be swayed by political pressure. Most of all, gratitude for my grandfather's foresight, which taught me that the best kind of trap is the truth, patiently waiting until the moment it's needed. In the end, the ranch is more than land. It's a testament to resilience, community, and heritage. It represents the idea that no matter how formidable an adversary may appear, justice can prevail when honest people unite. And for those who come after me, whether they are my children, my neighbors, or strangers who read about this place in some future article, I hope they'll see it as a reminder that we inherit not just property from the past, but also responsibility. It's up to each generation to guard what's precious against those who would exploit it, to stand firm in the face of intimidation, and to trust that truth, given the right nourishment, can grow stronger than any lie. As a final reflection, I want to share the core life lesson that emerged from this entire saga. A simple but powerful truth. When you protect what you love with honor, courage, and unity, you become part of something bigger than yourself. You not only preserve a piece of land or safeguard a family legacy, You also strengthen the bonds of a community and protect the future for generations yet to come. That is the real gift my grandfather left behind. And it is a gift that grows each time someone learns our story and remembers. Doing the right thing is always worth the fight.